On Q&A, part 2 of a discussion with co-authors Nancy Gibbs and Michael Duffy as they talk about their latest book entitled The President's Club, Inside the World's Most Exclusive Fraternity.
Michael Duffy, we haven't talked much about Jimmy Carter. Did you interview him for your book?
We did. He was a great interview. We interviewed him fairly late in the game. Great historical fact, in late September of 2012, this year, Jimmy Carter becomes the longest living ex-president in American history.
Longest serving.
If you can serve as an ex-president, yes.
Because Hoover was 31 years as a former president. He died in 1964, and so Carter will surpass
him sometime around September the 12th. And it's a reminder that when Jimmy Carter is tossed out of office in 1980, he's 53 or 54. He's looking at a very long period of life, and he has a crisis. He says, all right, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And he takes a couple of years, writes his memoirs, and then decides he's going to be this globe-trotting global problem solver. And he applies himself to this with an astonishing amount of energy. And the good news about that is that he did amazing work all around the world, whether it was disease or agriculture or political, squabbles. The bad news is sometimes is that he went too far when he tried to work with presidents who followed him, and they found him a essential but complicated partner. They would ask him to do things, Bush, Clinton, Bush, and Obama, but they also found that they really had to watch him carefully because he tended to do what he wanted. And so we have a number of incidents in the book where Carter goes overseas to perform special missions for presidents, but sometimes goes off the script.
Did anybody ever call Jimmy Carter, or vice versa? It seems like I remember one of these stories, and say, stop doing what you're doing.
Oh, yeah. In 1990, when George Herbert Walker is president and is about to launch the liberation of Kuwait, Carter, who had seen himself, and still does, as a sort of expert on the Middle East, thought that Bush was way out of line by sending 250,000 Americans or more to liberate Kuwait. And he began to campaign privately behind the scenes, first with the UN Security Council and later with key allies of the U.S. coalition in that effort, getting them to stop the path toward war. White House found out about this, and it told them through back channels to cease and desist. Even now, Brian, they kind of think this was close to treason for a former president. And Carter is not the only person who has been accused of coming close to treason in the President's Club.
You write, Nancy Gibbs, that Lyndon Johnson was friendless. Friendless. He had no friends?
Well, on the one hand, he was he's a huge personality and always wanted to have people around him. But coming after Kennedy, who with his charm and the aura of the big family and these very close, long time, the Irish Mafia and this group, that compared to him, Johnson was so insecure, was so haunted, I think, by the sense that he was not seen as a real president, as a legitimate president. He said, 2 days after the assassination, he said, I used to feel bad for old Harry Truman about how he got to be president, but at least his guy wasn't murdered. And so, the White House is an isolated place anyway. The circumstances and the personality of Lyndon Johnson, I think, made him even more isolated, and it made it even more challenging for him to really get his footing. And the way he handled that transition, I think, it stands up very well historically, of the way he reached out to people and brought them in and signaled continuity, signaled stability, I think was very important, and was, in a sense, vindicated by the scale of his landslide victory the next year.
What is the rule that you two use to quote other historians? I noticed that if you go to the source notes, there are all kinds of books that are quoted. What's the rule?
Well, I think we apply different situations differently. We relied particularly on about 5 or 6, I know I did, so much so that I felt that I needed to quote them, cite them, and occasionally praise them in the text of the book. That, for example, you can't really understand Nixon and Reagan unless you read Jim Mann's book about Ronald Reagan. You can't possibly understand Jimmy Carter and his post-presidency unless you read Douglas Brinkley's book on that. Tom DeFrank's work on Gerald Ford is essential reading to understand.
And was there agreement between those two that it wouldn't be published till he was dead?
That's right. In fact, it's called Write It When I'm Gone, the DeFrank book. So I think
Robert Dallek on both Kennedy and Johnson, Richard Reeves on Kennedy, and
another one that I saw a lot of reference to, and you actually quoted her in the book, was Monica Crowley.
Monica Crowley,
who had 20.
She's very interesting.
Yeah, well, explain why that she would be interesting.
Well, she was Richard Nixon's research assistant in the final years of his life, and she is a controversial person because she's written 2 books about her time with Nixon, based on her conversations with him. Some of them were clearly dictated on the same days. Not everyone who was around Nixon, friend or foe, believes that he possibly could have said all those things. But we tried to quote Monica, particularly where she was arguing against Nixon's interest, where she would, and there are many cases of this, particularly in his relationship with Clinton, where he just comes off as petty in his inability to understand why Clinton won't call him 3 times a day, for example. But we felt so dependent upon other historians to understand that we felt that simply footnoting the work wasn't really enough, and so we oftentimes cited their stuff. Lou Cannon on Reagan is essential. You can't possibly start writing anything about it. So we went. We may have gone a little overboard, but we wanted to give credit where it was due.
Who did you rely on for Harry Truman?
Well, among other people, Harry Truman. Obviously, David McCullough's great biography. But Truman, he wrote, after his presidency, not only his formal memoirs, but he wrote a book called Mr. Citizen. He wrote these books that were including about the ex-presidency and how he felt very strongly that the country should view former presidents as a resource, as he had viewed Hoover. This is, of course, partly him expressing his resentment that Eisenhower wasn't exactly viewing him as a resource. But often the presidents, in their own words, Eisenhower's formal presidential biography is not as revealing to me as his book At Ease, Stories I Tell My Friends, which is a much more informal, you really feel like you hear Eisenhower talking. So even Nixon's memoirs, which were a bestseller and which are very interesting in many places. So the presidents themselves are often, obviously they have an interest. Johnson's people working with Johnson in his post-presidency were horrified at how he would strip out all of the sort of colorful, vivid storytelling that he was known for, because he felt it didn't sound presidential, and that a presidential memoir had to have a certain kind of lofty tone to it. And the people around him wanted to capture what they felt was the real Johnson.
Right. And they all go through this. George Herbert Walker Bush wrote a memoir with Brent Scowcroft after he left office that is, even by their own admission, difficult to read. But then if you go to Bush's book of letters, they're the most human and revealing documents I think I read in the entire 4-year period. They're astonishingly confiding and very real, and turn on politics and personalities and how he feels about Nixon and stuff like that in very real ways. And of course it helped to then go back to Bush and say, well, what about this? And so he was helpful there. But the books, it's become a real business for the former presidents. This is one of the ways they support themselves. It's become in their interest to write more as we've gone from, say, 1960 on. So we get more books and you have a little more access. You just have to take each one with a grain of salt.
One strange moment in, it may or may not be considered strange by your analysis, but one of the strange moments for us here was when we had some videotape walking around George Herbert Walker Bush's gravesite with him.
Yeah.
And you mention in there, he tells, I think it's, explain it, Bill Clinton to determine where his gravesite's going to be.
Bush, the funeral planning of ex-presidents is a big deal, and as they get older, it becomes a bigger deal. And the Army, which runs these things, is on the former presidents like ferrets, getting them to nail down every detail, and it kind of drives all of them a little nuts. But they do talk to each other about how they do it. And at one point, Bush is visiting Clinton after his presidency at the library in Little Rock, and they're, it's set on a kind of riverside plain, and Bush is looking out the window at one point with Clinton, and he says to Clinton, that space there, what are you doing with that space? And Clinton says, I don't know. And Clinton at this point is maybe 60, 62, and Bush says, well, you ought to think about that as a burial ground, because you're going to need not just some place to be, but you got to have room for the cameras and the trucks and the crowds and the motorcade, and so within a year they're putting in electrical lines and running some cable out there, and all the ground is set. But I think it was because Bush had said to him, you need to think about that.
What's the meaning of when Bill Clinton asked to go out to Jerry Ford's grave in Grand Rapids and got several moments, I gather from the book, there by himself?
Clinton, after he leaves office, is giving a speech in Grand Rapids, and he a couple hours before the speech, he goes down to there's a Ford library there, and he says, "I'd like to see the gravesite," which is along the Grand River in Grand Rapids. And Marty Allen, who I think runs that library, the foundation, walked him down, and Clinton had flowers. He was all by himself and went in and just spent some moments in there with Ford's at Ford's tomb, where of course Betty Ford also is now. That's important because at the most horrible part of the Clinton presidency, the Monica Lewinsky scandal, Ford and Carter were working behind the scenes to try to convince Clinton not to fight all the way to the Senate, to take a censure first in the House and then in the Senate, something that would take the pressure off the political system and not force the country all the way to a Senate trial. Clinton's interested in this. He pursues it with Ford in particular. Clinton's guys work behind the scenes to see if Ford will be a witness for Clinton in the House. When that doesn't, Ford says, "I can't do that. These are Republicans who are after you. That's too much. But I might be able to make some calls for you." And even as it heads toward a Senate trial, Clinton is reaching out to Ford saying, "What else can we do?" And Ford wants to help, but Ford says to Clinton, I can help you if you admit that you lied." And Clinton can't go there. These talks break down. I think Clinton was always grateful for Ford's interest, both in protecting the presidency, but also in keeping the country from, corkscrewing into, the worst kind of distraction.
You said earlier in our conversation that you started with Harry Truman and you took it to, what was your cutoff for the presidency?
Mine was to Nixon.
To Richard Nixon. Well, what about the relationship between Richard Nixon and John Kennedy before? Early.
Well, one of the really amazing, of course, what I had not fully understood and is fascinating is that those two men were friends in the 1950s. They had come to Washington, to Congress at the same time. They had even shared a sleeper berth on a train when they were going to make a speech together at one point. Nixon was invited to Kennedy's wedding. The only reason he didn't go was because it was one of the rare occasions when Eisenhower had actually invited Nixon to play a round of golf with him. But the two men had, a fairly cordial relationship through the 1950s. 1960 election, of course, wound up being incredibly close. And the minute that it was over, any number of Republicans around the country were convinced that Kennedy had stolen it and are telling Nixon, "You should challenge the results." And in an extraordinary evening, just a few days after the election, Richard Nixon spoke to both Herbert Hoover and Eisenhower, two Republican former presidents who had no great desire to see John F. Kennedy in the White House. And both of them told Nixon not to challenge. Said the country it would not be good for the country, it would not be good for the office, it would not be good at a moment when all around the world you have these emerging democracies who are coming out of a colonial period and looking to the United States as a model, and the importance of smooth transitions of power as an example to the world was a higher priority than who was going to take office at any given time. And so both Hoover and Eisenhower advised Nixon not to challenge the results.
You have a quote in the book from Richard Nixon after he found out that John F. Kennedy had been shot, and it says, Nixon wept, quote, "Oh God, don't let him die," unquote. What was your reaction when you found that quote?
I think that there was real genuine affection there and a real genuine closeness, which surprises us as we think about these two men the way we see them now in history. But as two young strivers coming up through Washington, I think that there was a real connection between.
But also
those two
a time
men.
when Americans thought about their presidents differently. That they felt, regardless of party, a connection to them that they don't feel anymore. Where it's a much bigger partisan divide. It's really hard to imagine Democrats or Republicans having that kind of sentiment anymore.
How official is the President's Club as an organization?
Well, it's not chartered anywhere, and there are no legal documents. But it does have its own, sort of rules and taboos and feast days and things that it abides and things it will not abide. Here's a good example. After Osama bin Laden was killed by Navy SEALs in 2011, May of 2011, the White House quietly tried to, in fact, I think, tried to get all the presidents, put out feelers to all the presidents, former presidents, to come to New York, come to Manhattan, and for an event there near the World Trade Center site. And I think all of the former presidents said no. That's just way too political for us.
This is one where they would confer with each other and
a little between, yeah. I don't think they even, they may have conferred. I don't think they all. There was a point where you can't lean on us that much. That's something the club will not do. So is it official and chartered and legal? No. Is it real? Absolutely.
So you say you've discovered there's a townhouse on Lafayette Park.
On Lafayette Square, right?
Lafayette Square,
right? Exactly.
Where
they've just renovated it. It's very nice. But only
have you been in it?
Yes, I was in it last week for the first time.
Why? How did you get in?
Well, I asked, and we also went to get a camera crew in with CBS, which we did. White House was very helpful about that. It's run by the White House. Only 4 people can check into this hotel, which really makes it a very exclusive place. It's available for their use during the day. It's a parlor and an office on the first floor, 2 dining rooms on the second, and a bedroom on 3 and a bedroom on 4. Secret Service area in the basement. It's unmarked. It's freshly painted on the outside. It's beautifully redone on the inside. And about the only sign that you'd know that it was a former president's guest house is that in the office there is a bookcase with all of the president's papers in it, going back to Hoover. There's another sign that this began with Herbert Hoover.
I think the presidential seal embossed on the rug in the entryway might also be a giveaway.
And the bedspread.
And the bedspread.
But this isn't a shelter.
What's
channel.
it say on the
presidential seal?
President? Somewhere in here you allude to the President's Club and having a seal. It says, and I wonder. I said, did I read that earlier? Is there an actual seal that says the President's Club?
No. I don't think that.
Just the
I don't
president?
think we allude to the. I don't think that's right. But I think no. There's we don't. I think that you may have misread that.
I'm sure I did. Let's go back to another thing for people that like to hear about writing. When did you get your first interest in writing?
Oh, in about 3rd grade.
You remember the circumstances and why?
A ways back. Well, I love to read once I learned how to read. And so once you're reading books, the idea that you could write them too, and all you needed was, pen and paper. I just thought that was very cool.
Did somebody introduce you to reading?
A great 1st grade teacher. I mean, isn't it funny how all of us have these people in our lives?
What was his or her name?
Mrs. Flanagan. And Mrs. Flanagan, the life-changing intervention was, I went on a trip in 1st grade. And again, we were just learning how to read. And I went on a trip and I wrote this story about the trip that my family had taken. And it was 7 pages long. And we had 2 1st grade teachers. And I showed it to the other one first, and she read it and proceeded to tell me that I had started far too many sentences with the word then. And I think Mrs. Flanagan across the room saw my face fall and probably saw my future as maybe an engineer or a dentist.
Do you ever begin a sentence with the word then?
It still comes back to me, but Mrs. Flanagan came over and said, "Can I read your story?"
And this was in New York City?
This is in New York City.
When did you first get interested?
Well, I don't know. I think I had a freshman English teacher in high school named Sarah Paff who, in the absence of any evidence, thought I might be able to do this. And it would
Columbus.
Columbus, Ohio. And it would be many years before any evidence actually emerged. But she was the one who sort of said, keep going with this thing you're pathetically trying to do, and I think it could take you somewhere. And then in college, I worked on the newspaper.
Where?
Oberlin.
In Ohio.
In Ohio.
So research. How do you keep it all together when you're researching a book like this? What physically do you do with it?
We have very different styles that way. I go into Michael's office and I see these boxes and folders and leaves and stacks of, you need to
talk about your system.
Mine is much more virtual. Yours is very physical. Mine's very virtual. My research, as much as possible, I mean, God help me if I, drop my laptop out a window or something, because I would be in trouble. But again, because so many of these documents are now available digitally, that I would create these, immense folders on my computer of newspaper clippings. Again, so many newspapers now have their stories going back. You can get stories from the New York Times from the 20s and 30s really effortlessly. So I would collect all of this material and keep it all on my computer, so I could always I could be sitting in a coffee shop writing and have all my documents there with me.
She has documents. It's very nice. I have interviews. So it's just different, and I am a little more analog. I need things in binders, and I need them. I need copies of everything on paper, or I don't really feel I have my arms around them. And so yes, we're a little different. And I created large sets of binders for each one of these chapters, into which I then made lists of people I wanted to interview, because my presidents, being more recent, are still interviewable, and their staffs are interviewable, and I did a lot of that.
I know that in this book you interviewed 3 of the presidents. I actually wrote down somewhere the dates. Jimmy Carter on December the 2nd, 2011, Bill Clinton on November the 16th, 2011, and George Herbert Walker Bush on October the 7th, 2011. But beyond that, in your life with Time Magazine, how many presidents have you interviewed?
I think I've interviewed those 3 plus Ford. I've been in an interview with Obama, but I wasn't the only one. So Obama.
What about George Walker Bush?
Clinton, Bush 1, not Reagan, Ford, and Carter.
Which of all those was the, I don't want to say the best or the worst, but who was the easiest to interview? Who was the one that gave the most?
Carter's very confiding and fast. He talks very quickly, and Ford always wanted to be helpful, but by the time I was interviewing him, memory wasn't as strong. I've interviewed George Bush the first the most, and he's an excellent interview, especially if you stay on one subject and drill down. He's great, and Clinton's just fun. I mean, Clinton interviews you. You're kind of a bystander. Clinton and Bush 1, I think, are the best of those. But those are the people I've also interviewed the most, so it's not really fair.
Did you ask George W. Bush for an interview, and why didn't he give it to you?
He has been in this silent. I did. Yes, he did. He has stuck to his, I think, very carefully and shrewdly. I can't really argue with his logic. To his the current president deserves my silence, and I'm not ready to step out as a former yet. It takes some time. And he's been very disciplined about that.
Go back to your Time Magazine job. How did you get it? And what year was it?
A lot of begging and pleading. Back in 1985, when I'd finished grad school and I moved back to New York. And
What grad school?
At Oxford. And I really wanted to work at Time. It did something I thought was especially interesting and fun and appealing, of the notion of a weekly rhythm and of capturing what had happened in what was a reasonable space of time, that a week is enough time to look at an event and start to get a sense of and do some storytelling. And whereas a daily newspaper struck me as being at a too fast a rate, and a monthly, I would be too impatient. So I love the idea of a weekly effort at, first draft of history is the sort of presumptuous way news magazines have always. But I love that idea. And
go back though to the very beginning. What was
my
your
first job?
But how did you get that? Did you just ask?
Well, I applied and to be a fact checker, which was the classic entry-level job, and it took about a year before they had an opening for a part-time fact checker. So that was my first job. My job was literally to make sure that the names were spelled right and the dates were right, and I was told right off the bat, if I let 3 mistakes into the magazine, I was out the door.
And how about your situation? How did you get your job?
I was working as a Pentagon correspondent at a Washington newsletter called Defense Week, and Strobe Talbot called and said, "Why don't you come over and cover the Pentagon for us?"
Any difficulty in making that decision?
No, not. I don't think I hesitated. I worried a little bit that they'd made a mistake, and it didn't really. I really wasn't ready for Time Magazine, but turned out to be worked out okay.
As I recall, they were a little worried they made a mistake too.
They've been worried ever since. I mean, I think.
Go back. You in your biographical sketches that I've seen of you, they say Nancy Gibbs has written 100 cover stories for Time Magazine. What's that number now?
This is not something I've kept count of, but someone who was writing a book about the whole history of time, I think, had to figure it out and got past 140. So I think it's over 140.
What was your first cover story that you wrote?
My first cover story was about the growing tension between older people and young people in the sort of the age wars, the fight over resources of
What year?
What are we spending money on? 1988.
And how have you changed your approach to the cover stories since you began doing this?
It's partly how Time has changed its approach, and I've sort of ridden along with that. It used to be that it's always been a very collaborative system, but where a writer like me would be in New York getting interview materials and background and research from correspondents all over the country, and my job was try to pull it all together. Now, though, Michael and I have done a lot of these stories together. By and large, writers are fully responsible for their own stories. You do all your own interviewing, you do all of your own research, and so you're less likely to have 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 names on a story as back when I started out. It was great for people who were too shy to go do the hard interview. I mean, I did not have to get people to tell me things the way Michael was so good at. So it was a perfectly designed system for me.
Do you remember your first interview with a president and how you felt about it?
I remember having to go out the night before and buying serious shoes because I didn't have any. And you couldn't go into the Oval Office with the shoes I owned. So I thought, and the only good news is that same night I was out, I remember at a mall, this is 1988. I saw my Newsweek correspondent at the same store, and we ran into each other. So there I was. She was trying to find something serious to wear because their interview was always right after us. So I think that was the first time, and it was with, I think, Herbert Walker Bush, and he was still vice president, and he was just about to become president. And it was in the White House.
What about your interest in history? Your first book was about Billy Graham.
Billy Graham and the presidents, and we also wrote that together, and that grew out of really the 2004 election and being interested in explaining the role religion had played in that election and whether it was fundamentally different than past elections. And over the course of conversations we were having about that, we came to discover how peculiar it was that this one religious figure had these very close relationships with president after president after president after president. And in a way, that's the reason that book gave rise to this one, is Graham, as a global celebrity himself, with a kind of power and stature that almost rivals the president's, they did see him as a peer. And to the extent that the President's Club has sort of ex officio members, he would count as one, where they would talk to him and rely on him and trust him as someone who understands in a different way, but pressure and celebrity and the isolation of fame. And
well, they leaned on him to sort out their differences at times, where Bush 1 had Billy call Nixon when the two of them weren't getting along in 1992. There are times when Billy is the interloper between presidents he's known and former presidents he's known. So that's what sort of holds these two projects together in an unexpected way, is that they both are aspects of this private presidency. We all spend all this time covering the public part of the job, but the private part, which isn't very big, because so much of their lives are exposed and told and have to be by transparent, there are these private spaces, some about faith, some about the relationships with these other peers, that we felt were a little bit under excavated, and that's what the two have in common.
We have some, we have some video of the Reagan library dedication, and it's just silent. You can see it there with several of the presidents there. How often did presidents use these kinds of occasions to try to get everybody together?
These are President's Club feast days, and they work very hard to get to each other's library dedications. Yeah. Other than funerals, these tend to be the main occasions where they get together. The libraries are a big deal. They're a big burden. Raising the money for them, planning them is a big challenge. It's one of the things they sympathize with each other.
What do you think of libraries? Presidential libraries.
They're all. I mean, I'm just a fan. So we were talking to somebody the other day who says that they're just interesting places to go. They're American history. They're modern American history. They're getting better. The exhibitions are getting franker and more honest. They're government institutions, which makes them all the more interesting. And we're getting quite a few of them now. I've lost count. Are there 6, 7, 10, 12? I quite like them.
One of the things I didn't see a lot of in your book was the president's wives. And what role did they play in this? And did you all talk about whether or not you wanted to cover that a lot?
Well, of course, that would be a whole other book or several. And you're right. I mean, it was one of many decisions we had to make about what to put in and what to leave out. You know, the first ladies are really the only other people who are close to not only understanding the job, but continuing to talk to the president as though he is a real person and not, you know, a symbol. And one of the things that I think that is most distinctive that all the presidents discover when they take office is even people they've known for years talk to them differently, and everything gets filtered. And the fear that people are only telling you what you want to hear, that everyone's pulling their punches, that you're not having a real connection is, you know, a very understandable, difficult part of the job. The first ladies are the ones who tend to be able to get past all of the screens and the filters.
That's probably a part of the private presidency that's unwritable. I just think, you know, marriage is a difficult thing for anyone to understand, anyone else's, and every time we get close to those relationships, we realize we can't get much closer. And so someday someone may write a really good book about the presidents and their wives, but it hasn't been done yet.
Why Simon & Schuster as your publisher, and where did that come from?
We were lucky because a former editor of ours at Time, Priscilla Paynton, is now the editorial director of Simon & Schuster. And when we came up with this idea, we love Priscilla. She's a great editor, both for personal and professional reasons. If we didn't give her a first crack at this, we knew we would regret it, and we were lucky because she picked it up.
What about the history part of this? When did you first get interested in history?
You know, to me, history was always there. I don't know where the line was between just great history and great storytelling. These figures, especially, you know, when you read some of the great presidential biographies, they are every bit as engaging and fascinating as a great novel, except with the added, you know, fascination that it's all real. It all happened. And so, you know, to me, getting to try to understand why people do what they do and why things unfold the way they do is just the most interesting kind of detective story to read.
Your major at Yale?
History.
Your major at Oxford?
Politics and philosophy.
Your major at Oberlin?
English.
And what about your first interest in history?
Oh, it's so ironic because I think what really made me first think about books like this was reading Robert Caro's first volume on Lyndon Johnson, which was probably, I don't know, 1980? I don't know, to 82, somewhere.
Been doing
early
it for 38
80s.
years.
Yeah, so. Maybe late 70s. So those are the, I've started his new one. It's wonderful. It's great. It's make you weep good. But to be able to get that close and stay that close is a real challenge and a real gift. I would say this about the presidents, and this is why, to some extent, these projects appeal to me. If you spend any time covering them as a reporter on a day-to-day basis, you know the show, the part of the job, and you know the serious life or death part of the job, but they still are people, like the rest of us in some ways, and I always felt that the most interesting stories, the ones that people really want to read, are the ones about the things that aren't unlike everyone else, that are human. And involve human frailty and human triumphs and human difficulties.
As we get down near the end, I have a question for the two of you. What is it you most would like to change about Michael Duffy and your writing relationship?
This is great. This is a good question.
At this point,
I can cue you.
Okay, what should
You'd
I?
like me to produce this stuff faster? I'm a little slower. Nancy's very quick. I'm slower.
Comes from those cover stories she's been writing.
Yeah. All right. And I have a habit of not telling her what I've learned until the last minute.
That would be true. He holds out. He lowers expectations, and then at some point he'll surprise me, and I'll be like, okay, how long did you know that, and when were you planning to tell me? I've gotten
You get mad about it?
I'm trying to learn not to. I'm discipline of gratitude.
What would you most like to change about Nancy's way of writing and gathering information?
Well, mostly I'd like to be more like it. I think Nancy has taught me how to lift in ways I can't begin to describe. But I think what makes it work sometimes is that I'm always thinking about the dark side. I'm always thinking about, okay, what's really at work here? What are some of the more unlovely qualities of our subjects? And so I think I sometimes pull her down to earth, and she sort of lifts me up. That's I think why it's effective where it is effective.
Do we are out of time. Do we have another book in mind?
No.
We're going to be in recovery for a while.
Right, no. We need to go to book spa or whatever that is. Wherever writers go to recover, that's where we need to go. But thank you.
Nancy Gibbs and Michael Duffy, co-authors of The President's Club, Inside the World's Most Exclusive Fraternity. We thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
For a DVD copy of this program, call 1-877-662-7726. For free transcripts or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at qna.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.